I should declare up front that I am a big fan of newsbrands as a reader, as a part-time writer, but mainly as a creative agency leader and a bit of an effectiveness zealot, as Rufus said. I think the space that newsbrands own, curate and sell still works incredibly hard for brand owners. I'm very sceptical of some of the effectiveness claims made by what Alex Ferguson might have described as newsbrands' noisy neighbours in digital. To evidence my support for the medium, here's some work we do for other clients. If you're hand-making advertising for kettle chips to remind people that they were the original handmade brand, you don't want to hand over your buying to something programmatic to be viewed by bots. You want it to be enjoyed in a classically handmade medium. If you're selling national art passes for our charity client, the Art Fund, you need to be amongst art lovers. Your editorial is fantastically supportive of us there. And cast your mind back to a time when our national team was a source of pride at a World Cup. You afforded us a tactical opportunity for Vauxhall. This is the England women's team earlier in the year, allowing Vauxhall as a sponsor of Home Nations football to say, this is the year boys all over England score goals in their gardens pretending they're called Lucy. A few clues in those campaigns, I think, as to the power of news and news brands as context, to use Douglas's term. But the case that I'm going to talk about today is about something different. It's about news brands in the mix, more classically how they play a role in most advertisers' media portfolio. And it's a case study about three different roles for news brands in a campaign. Overall, to create engagement in a category, specifically at launch to help us create awareness, and then more recently to help drive action, which is, of course, where it all needs to end. The category in question is pensions. I can feel the sizzle of excitement coursing through the room. And the brand in question, as Rufus has said, is Scottish Widows. Part of the Lloyds banking group, alongside Lloyds Bank, Halifax, Bank of Scotland, and overall, as Rufus suggested, a client that is a very heavy user of your titles, very loyal user of your titles. I suspect that will be the same with the public share offering next year. Scottish Widows is a client and a company that sells the most distant of products, if you think about it. This is an income stream for your retirement. That may be as far as 50 years away from the point of purchase, and for most people is about 20 years away. For most people in this room, I suspect it's about 30 years away. But it's also a company, as we'll see, that has used what was described earlier as the most immediate and even disposable of media to sell that very distant product. So I think one way of thinking about today is simply that it's a case study of today's news selling tomorrow's product, which I suspect is the collective endeavour of most, or at least a few people in this room. But let's back up a little bit, because this is a strange old brand on first inspection. If you try to explain Scottish Widows to Lloyds Banking Group's Spanish management team, you can get yourself quite caught up. But there's logic to it, of course. The brand is 200 years old this year, and it was a fund that was first created to look after the widows and indeed the orphans that were left behind by those who didn't return from the Napoleonic Wars, so deadly serious intent at launch. It actually, for those of you who are keen students of financial history, it was part of a wave of funds that replaced the tontine, which were where families pooled funds so that when people died, their descendants were looked after. The flaw in that being that created an incentive for families to kill one another, which led to the new wave of more broadly pooled funds, of which Scottish Widows is one. Did you know that, Antonia? You do now. What Antonia does know, and what many of you in this room will know, is that the brand really came to life in the 1980s with a series of commercials which were first directed by David Bailey and which turned the name Scottish Widows into an icon, the Scottish Widow. You can date yourself by which widow you recognise most immediately. He and the agency at the time basically invested in TV to show the Scottish widow wandering enigmatically through mazes and along lighthouses and stuff to reassure us that she was a safe place for our money, much in the manner of the French lieutenant's woman. The upside of that is a genuinely iconic financial services brand. There aren't that many that have icons like this and that have cut through. And an agency, even a new agency like ours, is very respectful of a property like that to cut through. And as we'll see, that's exactly what has happened. The brief a couple of years ago to us, though, was to modernise the brand. That was the relatively easy bit, although I suspect Antonia may contradict that later. And to, I guess, confront the denial and the problem, the pensions time bomb that Rufus described earlier on behalf of this brand. Because a third of Britons aren't preparing sufficiently for our retirement, a third aren't preparing at all for our retirement, and 11 million people are at risk of pension poverty. This is a very real problem for British society, and I think as soon as we styled it as a social crisis, because government isn't going to dig people out of this hole, they've been pretty honest about that. As soon as we described it as a social crisis rather than just a commercial one for widows, I think that immediately nudged us towards newsbrand as an appropriate environment for our campaigning. So as I say, two tasks for us: modernise the icon and do what we could to solve Britain's later life problem. And then you face a problem, which is how exactly to do that. The first, as I say, relatively easy, the second much harder. The way most people in advertising have tried to solve that later life problem is to spook people with horrifying statistics, like the previous slide about how poor we'll be in retirement, or at the other extreme, to show rather strange alien images of couples on cruises, or the new advertising cliche, a 60-something with a surfboard. You've all seen it, you are completely unmoved by it, you have no idea who it was for, but someone at Getty Images got quite rich selling it over and over again. One problem is that no one knows who that advertising is for. The second much bigger problem is it's talking to us about our future. And as humans, we don't really care too much about our humour. We do care a lot about our humour, our future. We are wired for today. That is a plain vanilla fact about how humans work. It's actually why news is of such great interest to us and why gossip is. It's also a phenomenon known to behavioural economists as temporal discounting. I used that with the actuaries in our audience when we pitched. It's the phenomenon that we'd rather have £1 today than £2 tomorrow, which is true, and I'll happily take £1 off you today rather than hang around for £2 tomorrow. If that's the case, that we're wired for today, how on earth do you sell something where the benefit is 30 or 40 or even 50 years off? Well, we decided to lean into that truth about humans rather than lean away from it, and to try and dig around to see if there was an immediate benefit from funding a pension. So we asked the intermediaries who sell Scottish Widows products and their clients how they felt when they just started that pension. And one guy very brilliantly said, "Can I be honest?" He said, "Yeah, of course, that's the point." He said, "My big thing was, that's got Dad off my back." Because his dad had been saying to him for ages, "Please, son, start a pension." Everyone we spoke to talked to some degree about the peace of mind that they'd felt when they'd finally signed that piece of paper. And so we suggested to Scottish Widows that the brand should stand for today's benefit rather than this version of the future that we should all aspire to or be depressed by, and that they should campaign on the basis that a pension would give you peace of mind today and therefore license to enjoy more freely, enjoy life more freely meanwhile. So I suspect some of you have seen this, I hope some of you have seen this. Our campaign thought was life feels better when you have a plan. A new widow, Amber, and as you'll see, a sort of younger suite of both media and creative. Having mentioned intermediaries, though, I should just touch on one thing with an implication for media, and that is that our campaign had to not just be seen by consumers, but be seen to be seen by the intermediaries who would much rather represent a brand that their customers have heard of. And that's germane to the media plan that follows. We used TV unapologetically to create a little launch kudos. I'm going to show you a commercial very shortly. Also to turn the modernise dial, I suspect, more than other media could. If you have an icon like the widow and a goal of awareness, you're going to use outdoor. We did. Digital gave us a kind of campaign backstory and some proximity to the main online site for widows. And press became the hub of the campaign, the glue of it all, if you like. It gave us more frequency, it gave us more understanding. It enabled us to play out some of the stories that feature in this TV commercial.
What is your definition of happiness?
A clear horizon, nothing to worry about.
So I think it's fair to say a completely different take on pensions advertising, much more about the joy of life when we've made a plan. And print enabled us to tell that story in so many different ways, to break the TV down into pieces. Everyone who was cast in that commercial had a story, had a plan, was living life well. In print, just a few examples from dozens. The mum who's got a plan to look after herself and her son, the baker who aspires to have his own bakery, the vintage fan equally with her dreams. All of these people with plans rather than necessarily pensions, so that the brand could stand for much more than just annuities and premiums. But because we'd given the brand that higher order role, if you like, the kind of beauty of plans, it meant we could also work with newsbrands to create editorial streams that were supportive as well. Here's an example, working with the Telegraph to allow journalists free rein, hopefully observing the separation between church and state, to talk about their plans and how they could live for today because they had made exciting plans for tomorrow. The great upside of that is those stories then became Scottish Widows social feeds, which were immediately more interesting as pieces of content than the brand alone could have sourced. So a classically broad launch plan with kind of fairly plausible roles for each medium in it, and interesting findings for us when research came back, because pound for pound, press, print, newsbrands were the highest performing of all the pieces of the mix. We spent 3 times as much on TV to achieve the same level of recognition. Or rather than to denigrate TV, which I have no intention of doing, we spent 1/3 as much on press and achieved the same level of recognition. Perhaps Denise or others can explain why that might be, but certainly a critical pillar in it, exactly as planned. Now, the results from that first launch exceeded everyone's expectations in terms of priming people to make a plan, especially 15 to 34-year-olds, much to our surprise, I think, who just enjoyed a completely new dialogue about pensions, the one that their parents had enjoyed. Widows was returned to the most considered brand, but at the same time, government was beginning to meddle, and the category was becoming even more confusing. Some of you will remember in March 2014, there was a change to pensions legislation, so you could take a lump sum rather than being forced to buy an annuity. You're more likely to remember that Steve Webb, the pensions minister, said he was fabulously unconcerned about people using that lump sum to buy a Lamborghini and then falling back on the state. And I mention that because it was a completely accidental upside for us as advertisers, because our brand was already where the national conversation was playing out. Because the conversation around pensions and those changes and the Lamborghini was not playing out on TV, and it was not playing out on radio, with the exception of Radio 4's Money Box. which is a relatively small niche player. It was playing out in national press. It was playing out especially in the weekend newspapers, and our brand was there. But essentially, we closed a year with awareness high, just as planned, intentions good, equally planned, but action still trailing. So this year, the guys asked us to make sure that we could move the campaign on and create action. And to do so, we had to identify a new enemy, if you like, where at launch, the enemy of people starting a pension was the distance from today. Our new enemy was the complexity of the category, because it is undeniably complex. And again, we turned to behavioral economics to guide us through it, and we decided to do two things. Firstly, to chunk up this category, chunk up all the information to help it go down, something a newspaper editor does naturally to help people digest the news. And then to create a campaign that was time-based to create a sense of urgency. So again, you can immediately see that news brands might be useful to serve a strategy like this. This year's campaign is called Change Your Life in an Hour. The media model is for a hub, an online hub to be served by all media, or rather outdoor, press and digital, and to help people work their way through the tricky landscape of pensions. So no television this year, an online hub served, as I say, by other media. Still talking about individuals and human stories, this time talking about how big things come from small beginnings, in the same way as pension fortunes can be amassed from small premiums today. And you may recognize, if not this hub, although some of you have been, I know that, you may well recognize work like this running in news brands, both online and offline, or however we're supposed to talk about them. Everything from 3 minutes to remember what you always wanted to do, inspiring stories, this one about a woman who just decided one day to swim the channel, as you do, and worked her way towards it, through to, yes, 2 minutes to learn to love tax. So a hub of inspirational stories, the brand element, if you like, and then content that helps you find your way through it, including, most materially for most people, the jargon buster. If ever a category has needed one, it's this. But I'd encourage you to go on the website yourselves, just have a little look around it. Some of that activity is still live, but our results are already terrific. Brand consideration for widows is now at a new high, and we've had 250,000 visits to the website, which I think is pretty astonishing given the category. Most gratifyingly, perhaps, non-customers as well see Scottish Widows as leaders of the debate, the brand helping to be constructively solving the pensions time bomb. Now, I share that with you because you might expect a campaign like that to have sourced most of its visits from the kind of nearby digital activity. Surely most of the visits to the site would have come from anyone that was just one click away. Well, in fact, our data shows this. Print drove most visits to the online hub. Our visits to the hub spiked around the time of day when we placed those print executions in, for example, the Metro and the Evening Standard. And perhaps my favourite bit of data at all is the bottom one, that the print traffic that we had actually visited more pages on the site, leaned into the site, found out more from it. And I think that is the most interesting statistic. It's also the most logical statistic, because people reading news brands content are just that. They're readers, not users. And I know that sounds an incredibly obvious thing to say, but I think it's sometimes forgotten in the whirl of new media. As someone who works for a creative agency, I'd rather write advertising or help write advertising for a reader, not a user. And you know what? I'd gladly pay more for a reader than a user as well. And I think the newspaper industry occasionally does itself a disservice by forgetting that it serves extraordinary readers with engaged and attentive minds, rather than trying to battle others in the user count. So, I'm at the end. Print and news brands more generally have helped us in various ways, growing awareness, helping to drive action. They have given us cut-through and dwell time, advantageous context, to Douglas's word, for a product that's only occasionally contemplated and reluctantly purchased. You've given us proximity to news and some currency by association. Your editorial, unlike that of Reddit and BuzzFeed and Facebook, lends authority, accidentally or otherwise. And lastly, it's where those intermediaries congregate as well, so our work was both seen and seen to be seen. I thought I'd leave you with a short piece of journalism, very short piece of journalism, that I stumbled upon only last week in the Irish Times, only because I think it speaks to the qualities of news brands at their best in newspapers and some of the problems you may be having migrating online and that your competitors have online. So this is an article describing ad blockers and how the journalist in him loved it in one way because as a reader he hates ads popping up, and equally the journalist who knew that it was problematic for his employer if ad blocking was here to stay. So he simply said, if you're reading this in the good old-fashioned newspaper, you do so safe in the knowledge that no advert is going to suddenly burst from these words and bounce around in front of you like a giddy toddler. There's no actor in the corner of the page repeatedly pointing at the next page, suggesting you turn it to see their ad. There's no chance that you'll open the sports supplement and simply by holding the wrong part of the page, find yourself stuck in a mobile phone shop. I will not stop mid-sentence to suggest that you check out any sponsored content. I have no sponsored content. You paid for the paper pays me, I'm the only thing sponsored here. And I loved that because it spoke to me as a big fan of news brands, but who craves the next generation of intelligent and respectful advertising placement online. It's not in my interest, it's not in the agency's interest, it's not in clients' interests if ad blocking is rampant. And I think advertising, readers and shareholders alike will all be served well if we can all remember that we are in the business of readers, not users. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laurence, for it's a fantastically persuasive case study that we're certainly going to be using again. So thank you so much for presenting it in such a passionate way. We are really pleased that Antonia is here as well, Antonia Bennett from Lloyds, and we've got 10 minutes now to take a few questions from you, so please get your questions ready. I'm going to go and join them over here on the sofa. And I'll start with a question which is really about, it's really for you, Antonia, which is about media selection, because Laurence explained very clearly the role of the different media in this campaign. And I'm just wondering, as a client, how much you had the opportunity to involve yourself in choices of that kind, and what obstacles get in the way of doing that, and what you think clients generally, their attitude towards media selection is and ought to be.
We were very fortunate. We were, and actually, Laurence, it was lovely to see all that replayed. Actually, it was quite a nostalgic trip down memory lane. That we were very fortunate in the Scottish Widows campaign to take a very active involvement in the overall campaign. And actually, what we did, which was unusual for us, and possibly was unusual for a lot of clients, is that we made sure we had this sort of virtual team of working alongside. So client, media agency, creative agency, brand agencies, we were all very much in it together. So actually we had a lot of people influencing a lot of the discussions. So Laurence's team would be very actively involved in conversations about media. And I think it's something we just need to be doing more of, because I think we all know gone are the days of, determining a message for a particular medium and then just trying to translate that across all the different channels. So we'll start with TV, we'll do a still of that for outdoor, we'll do a cut down version of that for video on demand. It doesn't work anymore because the way in which readers, consumers, users are absorbing channels is changing so dramatically, and creating the right piece of creative for each channel is so important. And that's what we tried so hard to do with the Widows campaigns. There was a clearly defined role, as Laurence has so beautifully articulated, really clearly defined role for the pieces that were there to build the campaign, launch it, create the stature, give the new widow her opportunity shine. But equally, actually, where we wanted to engage in real conversations, and you've seen just what fertile territory, surprisingly, actually, the pensions market afforded us. Actually, to then engage in really deep conversations can only be done through certain media types. So we were all very, very involved in that conversation, and it helped hugely. It meant the creative was right for the channel. It meant we were directing the right messages to the right piece of activity, to the right medium, to the right piece of creative output. So I think the more that conversation is joined up, the better. I think historically it's been quite typical. To perhaps just let the planners tell us, and we'll do TV, we'll do a bit of this, we'll do a bit of that, and as long as there's a mix of everything, that's okay. Actually, probably not the most effective way to work, and I think it came together really nicely in this example.
It's very encouraging to hear that. Has anyone else got any questions for Antonia or Laurence? Towards the back there.
It's a question that's sort of linked back to Douglas McCabe, and I suppose it is for both Laurence, but primarily for Antonia. For the agency personnel here this morning, I suppose what Douglas was saying was highlighting that there seems to be a significant disparity growing between the agency folk and CMOs in terms of the future of media and advertising, and perhaps, I'm putting words into Douglas's mouth, but an element of distrust. From your perspective, Antonia, having seen what Douglas put up, which camp are you in? Are you more in the CMO camp, or are you leaning towards us agency folk?
I think Douglas had it spot on from my personal perspective. I think there is so much we don't know, and I think what is very difficult, particularly in financial services, we are very nervous, and what we need to do is try it, is test and learn. We don't know the right balance between broadcast and targeted activity. We know we probably can't switch TV and print off, and we've no desire to. We know there's a balance somewhere. We don't know where that sits, and we won't know, I guess, until we try and see and watch what happens. And equally, we are, I do think Douglas's stats, we're probably spot on. We are trying to strike that balance, and I imagine marketing departments up and down the country are trying to strike that balance. And if any of you in this audience can help us get there, you know, we want this insight as to where we should be playing a few tunes, trying things, testing, learning, failing quickly and understanding, hopefully failing cheaply and figuring out how to do it the right way. But we don't know the answer yet, and we do need some help in sort of finding our level there. I don't know if you've got a view on it.
I mean, I think we're all finding our way to a new equilibrium. I think the last few years have been the Wild West, and I think whether you are a reader or a user or a practitioner, I think we're finding out some stuff about the media we've invested in at speed with perhaps a little bit too much haste. And I think we're working our way back from that to a new equilibrium, but we'll get there. I just think it's a slightly turbulent path.
Yes, and it is very difficult with large brands, well-known brands with big budgets, to respond very quickly to some of this stuff. So actually we're probably not in a bad place in that in the time it takes us to really, I guess, sort of transform the way we operate, the skills we have, because there are a whole load of marketing skills that we are now acutely aware of our great big gaps in what we now need to do. You know, the future marketer looks very different to a marketer of 5 years ago, 10 years ago, certainly. So in the time taken to get there, hopefully we will answer some of these questions. But yeah, I wasn't surprised by Douglas's stats. I think we are a little nervous.
Thank you. Any more questions? Just over here.
Sorry, question for Antonia, actually. It's Clive from The Telegraph. How are you finding the pension changes? New legislation, obviously, the over 55s are now the position, some enviable position of being able to take out large swathes of cash. Is that completely affecting your whole business strategy?
It's had a huge, it's certainly had a huge impact. So as Laurence said, there were the unforeseen impacts of actually this suddenly became such a live topic. But I think I can't speak to the business strategy too closely. I've not been terribly involved in it for the past 12 months. But from an advertising perspective, what it allowed us to do was just have so many opportunities to have a conversation on something that was so live, sort of conversations that were very active. And I remember when we first met with 101, and one of the observations Laurence had said was that it is so unusual, it is unheard of in this country to sit and talk about finances, personal finances, in the way that people might do in the States. You know, to sit and have a conversation about, well, you know, have you got a pension and how much is it worth? It wouldn't happen around the dinner table in this country. And so what 101 did so cleverly with the campaign was to find those opportunities to have a conversation about pensions. So all of the change that happened, absolutely, they're having a huge effect on the business, not least generating huge amounts of traffic for people who just want to understand, but that in itself presents an opportunity to create the content that helps people through it. So it absolutely, right back to the message that we've obviously been hearing all morning around context. What I suppose the changes are affording us is a huge amount of context in which to provide content and engaging conversations that is hopefully helpful and useful, and hopefully to some degree, you know, sort of engaging and compelling.
That's sort of quite ironic, really, isn't it? In that, you know, it's brought pensions on the agenda, isn't it? Basically,
it really has. And the time of the launch was, it really was a perfect storm of, you know, changes to the IFA market in terms of transparency of charging, the ticking time bomb, people's interest at an absolute low, and then some of those sort of softer touches, like a bit of a nostalgia around a brand that people had recognised. There was just this sort of perfect storm of things that came together to make the timing of the campaign, and I'm sure influenced your strategy around the communication of it as well, Laurence.
Did you ever consider getting rid of the Scottish widow? Did you look at the pros and cons?
We didn't. Laurence may have at one point, I don't know. It's certainly, my brief was very firmly that she is kind of front and center. There was so much sort of warmth for a financial services company to actually have, you know, a living icon says something very powerful. But the warmth that she has always possessed. The real challenge was, as I think Laurence touched on, making that relevant today. So the idea that actually today we would have an engaging conversation on the back of seeing a beautiful woman walk through a stately home was a little bit a bit tenuous. And so I think what 101 and Laurence have done very successfully is given us that reason to talk to people and have a conversation about pensions today, and that had to bring the widow up to date, but she was absolutely front and centre always in my mind.
You do have some very strange conversations on this account, though, about how much widow you should have in an execution, because she brands the stuff improbably and impeccably, but equally she can get in the way when you're trying to tell a human story, so finding the right place for her.
Well, it's a campaign now that lots of different people can relate to, whatever their age, gender, ethnicity, in a way that perhaps it wasn't.
Exactly right. And as Laurence said, each of those individuals is a real story. They were authentic people. They weren't actors. They were brought in with their own stories. They all had a plan. That was part of the criteria. The widow historically has never interacted with people in sort of real life scenarios, and that was what, hopefully, again coming back to context, I think that's what the new campaign has really allowed us to do.
She also used to appear at events like this.
She did.
But I think that's a bit spooky. Maybe that's just the man in me.
We don't have her here today, but it's fantastic to have both of you. Thank you so very, very much for coming and telling us about Scottish widows. That's all we've got time for, though. Thank you so much.
Thank you.